that's their artillery. There should be their infantry. See? Sorry, my history degree must not be good here, huh? Yep, so this is going to be the British side, but they have the cannons. They should have an infantry, their foot soldiers.
Thank you very much. That was the last group of tunes that we're going to play tonight. We're going to march off to a tune that I'm sure you will recognize. I want to thank you very much for your attention and kind applause. If any of you are interested, or you know somebody who might be interested in joining our group, you can find us on drums1812.org. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Title escapes me at the moment.
Did you guys only see one person lying down? There was 2 or 3, but then they kept evacuating the soldiers and taking them to the surgery at the back. Taking their wounded soldiers to get patched up.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, a very strong round of applause for the Fifes and Drum. The Fifes and Drum put in a huge amount of effort in order to get good at this, because let me tell you, you do not want to hear what bad fife and drum sounds like. The two armies had squared off repeatedly, but they both need to rest. The Americans fell back to Fort Erie, which they had fortified by extending it 800 meters south. That's about 900 yards for any of our imperial-minded folk. All the way down to about where Albert Street and Lakeshore meet up, which was a spot known as Snake Hill. The fortified American position was a plan of their commander, General Jacob Brown, because he noticed in previous invasions the American army had not had a base within the Canadas which they could fall back to. Fort Erie was his fallback position. So after Lundy's Lane, the Americans fell back here, began to regroup, began to recover. They had lost a lot of their commanders as well at the Battle of Lundy's Lane, with 3 of the 4 generals on the field being wounded. The only one who didn't get wounded, I don't want to say he got killed, because they didn't get that either, but Eleazar Wellick Ripley, which if you're from Maine, he's from there, so there you go. Nobody from Maine, so cut those jokes out. But in that, when he left the battlefield, he had 3 horses killed under him, he had 3 musket ball holes that had gone through his hat, and he had 7 that had gone through his coat. So it was a very close and very dangerous engagement, and he led the initial falling back to Fort Erie. However, General Brown felt that he wasn't a good, tough-minded general to hold on to this place, so he brought in Edmund Pendleton Gaines, whom Gainesville is named after in the United States. The British arrived not long after the Americans in early August, and they set up siege lines about 1,000 yards north of the fort, almost a kilometer, and they began to bombard the fort with heavy cannon. Although it was noted that the bombardment was wholly not enough, one officer in the British Army said that the cannonballs bounced off the stone structure like tennis balls. You got to keep in mind, those buildings, 3-foot thick stone walls. And they're just bouncing off of them. Now, that didn't mean that the Americans weren't suffering casualties, it just wasn't sufficient. Until one day, they hit a magazine, and a huge fireball went off in the American camp. And the British cheered, believing that they had done great damage to the enemy, particularly when they heard screaming coming from the American fort. But it wasn't screaming, it was cheering, because the Americans had noted that not one man had been injured or killed by the explosion, and they were cheering their good fortune. This miscommunication and all the British confidence would lead to them launching 3 assaults against Fort Erie in the dark of the night. Now, I will repeat, Jim earlier mentioned about it, how the Niagara Parks Commission has been putting this on for 37 years. That's how long I've been on this earth. So I guess it's a good thing I keep coming back. But the thing that's amazing about this is that this event functions because of volunteers and the immense amount of work they do. The reenactors put a huge amount of effort into this through their research, through the putting together their uniforms, learning the drill, everything. And without them, none of this could happen. So we're very pleased. But there is another group of people who, if it weren't for them, this would never happen. And it's you guys. If nobody showed up to watch this, we would probably stop doing it pretty quickly. So we do appreciate all of you coming out. But as this is a free show and the Niagara Parks doesn't receive tax dollars, hasn't since 1885, if you like what you're seeing, there's great ways that you can help support what's going on here, and there's great ways to ensure we can keep doing it. Everything from as simple as buying ice cream at the Welcome Center to purchasing a ticket for our night tours, coming back tomorrow even. That's still going on tomorrow, so I'll expect to see some of you. And as well, another way you can support is you'll notice that we have sent some of our most fetching staff out and about with buckets labeled Support the Fort. So if you got a bit of change in your pocket, we would really appreciate to lighten your load. You can just throw that in there. If you got a $5 bill that looks out of place, I know where it looks in place. $10 even better. If you give $20, I'll shake your hand. $50, I'll give you a hug. $100, I won't hug you. I've done it. I have somebody doubting me. I have hugged 3 people at this fort. Not this year, but a couple years ago. Nope.
We could probably move up a bit if you want. So they wouldn't mind.
Now, when the British decided their assaults, there are 3 different assaults. The first was to the south of us at Snake Hill, at the extreme of the American positions. Leading the assault was the regiment de Watteville, which our friends from Lithuania were speaking a little bit about earlier. And the Wattevilles were an extremely interesting unit because even though they were labeled a Swiss regiment, as mentioned earlier, they drew their recruits from all over the place. They had men who were from Italy, from the Balkans, the Baltics, Ukraine, Germany. There was even listed a mess group that was made up of men who were listed as Turks. So the British, I'm going to be honest, they didn't care. If you could shoulder a musket and you were willing to fight, they'll have you. Now the Wattvilles, unfortunately, thanks to the British command not trusting them as they were considered foreign in their eyes, they ordered them to remove the flints from their muskets. Now the flint is necessary for these muskets to fire. When you watch them shoot, that initial spark is the flint striking against the steel to ignite the side pan. If you do not have a flint, you cannot shoot. And this sounds crazy, but it makes sense. Muskets in this time period took as long as 20 seconds to reload. Even in good hands, it takes about 10 seconds. Do you know how long it takes to reload a bayonet? Way quicker. So during an assault, you want to approach quietly, and you...
That's not quietly.
I'm going to state right now, me saying quietly and that going off, perfect. They're listening. But ladies and gentlemen, when you're coming in with the bayonet, you're coming in quiet, you're not supposed to be seen, and at the last minute, overwhelm the enemy with the bayonet assault. And the bayonet was terrifying. A triangular blade that was not sharp. When it pierced you, it tore its way into you and would leave gruesome wounds that were extremely difficult to patch up. Bayonets had almost a 100% fatality rate if they got you in the torso, and the British were hot on the heels. Americans deployed pickets like you see out here, light troops that would be scattered out in front of the fortifications. Their entire job was to be a human tripwire. When you spotted the enemy, you would start shooting and start falling back. The men who were pickets at Snake Hill had the British so hot on their heels that their commander received a bayonet wound to the rear end as he was being pulled up and over the wall by his compatriots. But the doom that they faced there came from what we just heard a moment ago, artillery. Snake Hill had been fortified with 6 cannons in it, which were all firing canister shot, which rendered the guns into basically giant shotguns, and those troops were torn to pieces. To the credit of the Wattvilles, despite the British command doubting their ability, they would charge that position 5 times, which is made all the more amazing because not only were they facing a galling fire, due to an error on the part of the engineers, their siege ladders were 6 feet too short to get over the walls. In their final assault, they actually attempted wading into the lake to get around the position, but the swift currents drew most of them away, and they were drowned. So you can see the pickets beginning to fall back. Pickets are light troops, so they spread themselves out and they kind of do more of a scatter shot at the enemy. The idea is to poke at the enemy and agitate, kind of feel out where they are, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and then get out of the way of the main body. So you can see British light troops also coming out. Now, one of the myths that is constantly spoken of is people talk about the British must have been easy targets in their bright red uniforms and their white shoot me here X's across their chests. But the red uniform makes a lot of sense, and you're beginning to see why. Black powder produces immense amounts of clouds of smoke out on the battlefield. And these clouds could often get so thick you could not see what was in front of you and who you were shooting at. At Lundy's Lane at one point, the 2 armies were less than 15 feet apart and could not see one another. American officer who stepped in line said he saw the muzzle flashes crossing in the air. The 2 armies were so close. Now this comes back to that red coat, because if you were walking out of the thick smoke, you wanted something that screamed to all your friends, "Do not shoot me." So a bright and distinctive uniform was common across most European armies of this era. The British in their bright red, the Americans in their bright blue.
Coming back?
Come back. He's had to walk.
Now the second attack that was launched against Fort Erie was actually along what today would be Lakeshore Road, attacking American position that was between the fort and the river. They had built a battery straight down, an earthen wall with cannons mounted on it, and they were prepared to defend themselves quite well. And unfortunate for the Americans, very unfortunate for the British, the first assault at Snake Hill had pretty much been thrown back before the second assault had even gotten within range. By the time this second assault, led by the 103rd Regiment, finally closed in, they were met with heavy cannon fire and musketry. Their commander, Colonel Hercules Scott, one of the first men killed, struck in the forehead with a piece of grape shot. And his lead element, his forlorn hope, in the space of about 15 minutes, lost 80% of their men, ripped to pieces by the American position. It did not take long before that assault, too, was rebuffed.
Which one's our team? Canada hails from the British Empire. The red
Now, are there any good, proud Canadians in the crowd?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm very pleased to announce that on the field today is a unit that is representing a 100% Canadian regiment. And you'll see them fighting for the Americans. In 1813, Joseph Wilcox, a sitting member of the legislature, defected to the Americans, accepting a commission and raising a force of about 150 disaffected Canadians to fight alongside him. These were some of the hardest fighting troops the Americans had in the Niagara. During the attack on Buffalo in 1813, they were the ones who delayed the British Army for 3 hours at a bridge. And the reason they're doing this is because, well, guess what happens to them if they're taken prisoner? They won't be prisoners very long. Now, for those good patriotic Canadians, I'm pleased to announce that their commander, Joseph Wilcox, got what he deserved. During the siege of Fort Erie, during one of the skirmishes, he was shot and killed, and he now lies in an unmarked grave in Buffalo. That's a perfect end for a Canadian traitor. Amongst the Americans, you'll notice some of them are wearing gray uniforms instead of the traditional blue. This is because when the war broke out, blue dye prices skyrocketed because Britain was the major supplier of blue dye for the United States. By the end of the war, the cost of blue dye had increased 15 times over its pre-war cost, so they had to make do with what they could get a hand on. There are records of men in brown uniforms, black uniforms, green, even a very ugly yellow uniform. But here, the gray uniform became famous when Winfield Scott's troops were issued them. They derided them. These were work jackets, slave jackets, some of them called them. This is something you wear cleaning a stable, not fighting for the Republic. But men in gray at Chippewa and Lundy's Lane stood toe-to-toe with the British and fought them either to defeat or to a standstill. And so the gray uniform became a symbol of this new professional army. And if you don't believe me, go to West Point Military Academy and tell me what color the uniform is today. It's not blue. Now in the British forces, there are some green-coated troops that are marching across. We have troops of the Glengarry Light Infantry, a Canadian regiment raised primarily in the Kingston-Prescott area out of Scots and Irish immigrants. They originally were asking to wear Highland gear, including full kilts. But then when they saw the price tag, like good Scotsmen, they went for the cheaper option, which was the green uniform. And next to them, with the red cuffs and collars, are soldiers of the 2nd York Militia. Raised in Toronto, militia, the 2nd Yorks were raised to defend the area, and militia pretty much had their regions, but those who had proven themselves would be issued a uniform. Blue trousers and green jackets by 1814 was one of the most common uniforms you would find being worn if militia could get a uniform. A lot of militia had to make do wearing whatever clothes they had lying about the house, which leads to the issue of identification. So from battle to battle, they would try to identify themselves in various ways. For example, during the siege of Fort Erie, New York militia wore red hat bands and armbands to identify themselves out on the field. Now, I mentioned there were 3 assaults against Fort Erie. There was one last one, which was against the rear fortifications of the fort, where the earthen hill is today in the middle. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Drummond, no relation to General Drummond. This Drummond's the one they named the street after in Niagara Falls. Oh, it's a road. I've been corrected. I have a civil engineer next to me. Oh, he's from Niagara Falls. Just as bad. But, so what happened is he led his men in assault, and the men he was leading was the 104th New Brunswick Regiment. And the New Brunswick Regiment led their assault with support of some Royal Marines and some naval support, as well as some of the men of the 103rd that had broken away from their failed attack for one last assault. They made multiple attacks, each time being repulsed, before their commander realized there was one weak spot, the cannon bastion. Where the flag flies today, the British threw up their siege ladders and climbed over. Drummond giving his last military order, give the damn Yankees no quarter. Under the rules of warfare, a fort that resisted you had surrendered any quarter and would be killed.
No, they do not get into the fort. We watched it. They don't get into the fort.
Now, you've seen the British lines moving out there and firing those volleys. I mentioned the difficulty of the muskets, with sometimes they don't like to work with the flint being exposed. They're also very inaccurate. Muskets of the time period past 100 yards could miss their target as much as 9 feet in any direction. So firing in volleys would counteract its issues. You would ensure that somebody with a working musket has hit something. And that made the musket extremely effective, even out to 200 yards away. And you'll notice ladders being carried forward with the British forces. You gotta get up and over the walls. So find a couple of luckless fellows with good shoulders, and that's their job. Typically, they would be right behind the first wave, which would be your four-lone assault. And these four-lone assaults typically suffered heavy casualties. The 2 previous assaults both suffered almost 3/4 casualties. Now, another thing you're seeing is, you notice not all the British are always shooting at once. They try to make sure somebody has a loaded musket. These are called rolling volleys. So imagine 1,000 soldiers. The first 100 present, fire, and then they continue down the line. By the time you get to Company 6, Company 1 has reloaded and can continue to fire again. What you have done is taken 1,000 men and turned them into a machine gun, and they will just wipe out whatever's in front of them. Line battles were extremely gruesome, and this is why the training of the time period trained men not to be like a modern soldier and think individually. You were a part of the machine. You are a cog in this machinery, and wherever the machine goes, you go.
Oh no, someone got her.
They said that the natives led the
No
battle.
matter where we go, we can't win. Yeah.
Now, we do have some of the indigenous allies of the British out on the field. By 1814 in this area, most of them would have been refugees from the Western Confederacy who had fled towards the Burlington Heights area and still wanted to get at the Americans. You also still found a small number of Iroquois. However, the numbers of the Iroquois had dissipated very much so after the Battle of Chippewa, where Iroquois aligned with the Americans fought against Iroquois aligned with the British. And when they realized it was basically turning into a civil war for someone else, many of the Iroquois packed up and left rather than risk killing other members of the Confederacy.
Watch for the long stick.
But also there's a long stick that goes by. And that's the limb stop. That's a big spear.
No, we've been through this.
It's a safety thing. They wouldn't
Did you find the wall and get him out for it?
I guess so. I don't know.
You almost need one set of cameras here, a set of cameras there, a set of cameras. Like
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
need multiple people filming at once.
Well, the other thing I can do from here is get a cannon.
Now, one of the difficulties that Drummond's assault against the Northeast Demi-Bastion faced was the ditch itself. Today, the ditch is nice. It's kind of manicured a little bit after getting mown down. But 200 years ago during the siege, it would have been used as a barricade in the sense that it would have been filled with garbage and sewage for you to run through. It also would have had stakes jabbed into the hills and in the base for men to possibly impale themselves on, and even have an 8-foot-high wooden wall in the middle of it. So what you would often have are pioneers that would be in your assaults. There's a couple in the British lines. You can identify them by their large beards and their big aprons. These men would go into battle not only with a musket, but also carrying an axe, a pick, usually shovels. They're combat engineers. They come in to chop down or smash whatever's in the way, and they're very good at it.
When this battle is over, there's a bit of a break. You move all the guns outside the walls. And then do an artillery thing. Big flap one. Big gun.
We're gonna do over there.
After, yeah. Because that's when they have the lantern tour inside. Pretend they're inside the walls while the battle's going. I used to be on one of them. I was reserve artillery. Local around here. Egypt, Cyprus.
What do we want to do?
Well, everybody's kind of going down. I don't know if they'll be able to get me.
Yeah.
I'll give you a heads up when those is going to happen.
I just want to say, just down there.
Going to be some big very short. I'll let you introduce me to the guy after.
Call him back.
Actually, stay right here.
Now you can see inside the fort, you can see some of the American colors, their regimental colors flying over the walls. Regiments in this time period were issued 2 flags in both the British and the American forces. However, there was one regiment during the siege of Fort Erie that actually had 3. The Regiment de Watteville was actually issued with a special Swiss color that they would carry out onto the battlefield as well. And we see some of the British storming into the ditch, probably looking for some way to get up and over the walls or a nice spot to get in. Now, this design of Fort, the Star Fort, came from a French marshal named by the name of Marshal Vauban. The star-shaped fort provided no blind spots, so even if you're pressed against the wall, there was somebody who could shoot at you. Their weakness, though, was if you could infiltrate one of the points, because they typically opened up as you charged inside.
Now they're storming.
Now, as the British did take the Northeast Demi-Bastion, you would think then it would open up. The problem they encountered, though, was the earthen wall in the middle of the fort created a bottleneck. Drummond and his troops could not force their way in, but nor could the Americans force them out. Drummond would actually be killed in the battle, shot through the chest, and then bayoneted. There's an old wives' tale, I guess you could say, that when he had passed and they inspected his body, they found his orders for the battle pierced by the bayonet, and the section that it had underlined was the word bayonets, and free use of the bayonets are encouraged. Seems a bit too good to be true, but still a good story. Now, as the armies fought back and forth inside of Fort Erie, the fighting was absolutely brutal. At one point, the bodies were said to be stacked up outside of the bastion inside the fort as much as 3 to 4 deep, with one account saying they were a writhing mass as the wounded tried to crawl out from the weight of those on top. In desperation, the Americans turned a cannon around inside the fort and began to fire at the British. The British responded by turning around one of the captured cannons and shooting back. Guns that are designed to kill men at 800 to 900 yards are now being used at about 60 yards apart from one another, and the carnage was unimaginable inside, as these guns were designed to cleave through as many as 30 individuals at 450 yards. Now, as the fighting dragged on inside the fort, the British began to realize that they had a bigger problem. Dawn was rapidly approaching, and when the daylight would come, their advances would be easily spied by the enemy, and they could easily cut them off. If they were going to take the fort, they had to take it soon. And with trickles of reinforcements, the men grouped together at the base of the bastion in the ditch, bayonets fixed, waiting to climb up the ladders. But as one British officer noted as he climbed up and into one of the embrasures, the men were packed in, shoulder to shoulder, barely able to move. The British just couldn't push in any further, and their men just kept on cramming in and heavy.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I do apologize for not warning you about the cannons, but I'm deaf in my right ear, so it's not a problem for me. Don't worry, you come to enough reenactments, you'll be just like me.
There's that one going on.
It was actually interesting, during the heat of the fighting, some of the reinforcements being led forward were not being led by one of the normal officers. It was actually being led by an assistant surgeon by the name of William Dunlop, 19 years old. As he was leading the men forward, he noticed how many of the wounded and dying lay on the field as they approached, including one incident where he stepped on one of the men, and the man let out a hideous groan in his account. Approaching up to the fort, he could see how hot the engagement was. He got within 100 yards of the fort. Now, during the fighting, the Americans some of them were inside of the stone blockhouse shooting out at the British, and they heard a voice call out to them, "Come over, you rascals. We're Irish rebels and English deserters," trying to encourage the British to give up their cause. But what ended the British cause that night was an explosion. Underneath the feet of the British was a powder magazine, and somehow during the fighting, it ignited. The explosion was said to be a 200 to 300 foot high tower of flame, carrying with it earth, timber, iron, and flesh. About 200 men were killed in the explosion, not just from the initial explosion, but also as men on the walls were thrown into the ditches, landing upon the bayonets of the men beneath them. Debris crushed men in both armies, and the attack failed in that moment, with the British retreating in disarray. Now, ladies and gentlemen, with the reenactment coming to our conclusion, there is a very old tradition amongst the reenactors, and that is the fact that with the information these people have come to know, with the education that they have put themselves through, they have learned so much about the individuals here, and they understand that they are on a battlefield. Men fought and died here, and some are still buried here. And it is a tradition in honor of those individuals, it did not matter which flag they fought for, that a lament is played. So ladies and gentlemen, during the playing of the lament, we ask that you please observe silence and please remove any caps. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for all of the reenactors who have come out this weekend, who have invested so much time and energy to come out and do this for us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the battle is over, but I do have to say the evening is not. If you have already purchased tickets for our After the Battle candlelight tours, you can begin to make your way up to the Welcome Center. If you have not purchased tickets, you can begin to make your way up to the Welcome Center. If there's one thing I have never heard anybody complain about, it is my narration and the After the Battle tours. But I'm also modest. So if you want to head up there, it's a great show. It's one of my favorite things to do, and it's one of the reenactors' favorite things to do. The next thing I must ask is please do not enter the field, as the field needs to be cleared to ensure there isn't anything out there that could possibly harm anybody. We had 2 years with 0 incidents. We're going to try to keep that rolling. And so we're going to ask you, please stay off the field. But if any of you look out at this and you think this is pretty cool, how do I end up doing this as well? Good news. You talk to any of the reenactors in the camp, and they would be more than happy to give you information on how you could come out and you could join one of these units. And next year, you can come out, wear wool in this heat, and shoot guns at one another.